What's up, audio geeks? Welcome back to the studio. In today's video, we're going to be talking about some more Pro Tools settings that you have to know if you're going to try to work with Pro Tools. And this is really straightforward. We're not going to go into detail on every single setting. These are only the settings that really matter if you're just trying to record yourself at home, if you're producing yourself at home and you are using Pro Tools. These are the settings that you should know. So let's get into it. The settings that you need the most are going to be found on the Setup tab. The first one that we need to be mindful of is the Playback Engine tab. This is probably the most important dialog in Pro Tools because it's here that you're going to actually deal with any latency issues that you have. You're going to select what interface that you're using, as well as some minor other options that you really need to know. So the first setting that we have is the device, where in my case, I just have Pro Tools Aggregate I/O because that will essentially combine the microphone of my MacBook Air with the output of my MacBook Air. If you're using any other interface, if you're using 2-channel interface, 4-channel interface, or how many channels you have, this is where you would select what interface you have. Next, we have the Settings tab. On the Settings tab, you have the hardware buffer size, which essentially deals with how much processing power that your Pro Tools rig will have versus how much latency you will have. The smaller the buffer size, the less processing power you will have, but the lower the latency. The way this works is Pro Tools will essentially buffer an amount of audio that will get processed at one chunk. The larger the chunk, the more time it takes, but at the same time, the more processing power you have. So the way to set this is set this as low as you can if you're tracking and set it as high as you can if you're mixing. That should essentially take care of any latency issues you have and any processing power issues that you have. The voices amount here just shows you how many tracks that you can have active any one time. If you're on Pro Tools Ultimate running a native rig, you probably will have 2048 voices, which is pretty close to infinite because you're not going to have 2048 tracks unless you're crazy. Next, we have the Video Engine Enable. I would recommend not using the video engine unless you're actually working with video. Optimizations. The Optimizations tab is where you can improve the performance of Pro Tools without changing your buffer. I would always keep Ignore Errors During Playback Record on because that makes sure that you won't be stopped while you're recording because maybe something just ran into any processing. You can also check the Minimize Additional I/O Latency if you're having any sort of latency issue that you haven't been able to fix any other way. But this is mostly for legacy interfaces. If you're using a newer interface, you probably won't have an issue with this. Next, you have Dynamic Plugin Processing, which will essentially make it so that your plugins won't be doing anything unless audio is actually running through them. This will greatly improve the performance of Pro Tools, and I would definitely recommend keeping this on unless you're having an issue with any specific plugin that does not support this feature. This is a lot more common if you're using any legacy plugins, but for the most part, you won't have an issue with this on. Finally, you have Optimized Performance at Low Buffer Sizes. You should always keep this on because if you're using a low buffer and you just need to get the most out of your processor and you don't have this on, you might run into issues. So keep this on and you won't have any issues. Finally, the last setting, Cache Size in the Disk Playback dialog, essentially just tells Pro Tools how much memory you're going to allocate to running the session. You would usually keep this in normal unless you want to make Pro Tools use less memory or more memory for any specific reason. In older versions of Pro Tools, this is more important. In any of the modern versions of Pro Tools after Pro Tools 11, you should always keep this in normal. Just hit OK and you're done with Playback Engine settings. Next, let's go to the hardware dialog. The hardware dialog will change a lot depending on what kind of interface you're running. For the most part, unless you're running a DigiLink interface, you will get this Launch Setup app and that will take care of all your settings. If you're running a DigiLink based setup, then you probably don't need this video and you will know what's going on in here. So we're not going to go over too much of what's going on in the hardware setup. The only thing that you need to know is that the hardware setup window will essentially take care of any clocking issues that you have if you're running DigiLink based interfaces. You can hit OK, and next let's go to the Preferences dialog. This is the largest dialog in Pro Tools pretty much, and you'll get pretty much all sorts of different preferences set. I'm just going to recommend a few that you will probably want to change if you just got Pro Tools. The first tab in this dialog is the Display tab. The Display tab essentially takes care of the look of Pro Tools. It takes care of the colors in Pro Tools. It takes care of how Pro Tools looks if you're using the classic UI or if you're using a dark UI. And it also takes care of how plugins are displayed. The things that I would generally want to change is to go to the basics, go to organize plugin menus by category and manufacturer, have this on, because that way if your plugin list is too large and you know a plugin is from a certain manufacturer, you can just go straight to that manufacturer and you'll easily find the plugin. The next one is organize track IO by type. I would go by type and width. That way you can easily find your stereo pairs and also find the type of path that you're dealing with. Next, the UIT is where you would pick between the classic UI and the dark UI. It really depends on what you like. I personally hate the dark UI, so I just go with the classic. The next one I would be mindful of is the color coding. I would always put the default track color coding to track type and the default clip color coding to track color. That way, whenever you create a new clip inside a track, it will assume the same color as the track, which just makes your life a lot easier when you're trying to find stuff on a track. If you work with posts, you might want to change this because it makes it easier to differentiate between clips. But for music, I would keep this in track color. The operation dialog will take care of other important settings in Pro Tools that usually deal with how Pro Tools works. The transport settings, you should usually keep it edit insertion follows scrub shuffle. That way your edit playhead will always be the same as your actual playhead. Also keep the numeric keypad setting to transport. That way you can use your keypad to deal with the transport on Pro Tools. You might want to change this if you have a control surface. If you don't, just keep it transport. The most important setting here is the auto backup setting. I would keep this on, keep 10 of the most recent session backups and backup every 5 minutes. That way, you should be pretty safe from any problems that you might have. You'll always be backed up. Let's go to the editing dialog. This might also have something important for you, which is clip list selection follows edit selection. That way, if you select a clip, you'll get the same clip on the clip list on the right side of Pro Tools. And edit selection follows clip list selection. The same would happen if you select a clip on the clip list. That will probably select the clip on the edit window as well. Auto name separated clips. This is really important. You should always keep this on because that way the clip will always have a new name every time you cut it. And that way each clip is an individual instance of each clip. Another really important setting is the levels of undo, where you have 64. You can have up to 64 levels of undo. I'd recommend you to keep this at the maximum that you can. That way, if you mess up, you can fix whatever you messed up for quite a while. Another important setting is the crossfade dialog. If you're working with music, I recommend keeping this X crossfade. If not, I'd recommend switching to equal power if you're working with post-production, because this is just a little bit more natural for dialogue and effects. But for the most part, I keep it at equal gain. Next, mixing dialog. This is where you can select what default EQ that you use. If you really like a certain EQ plugin, you can select it from the list here and just have it be easily accessible in your plugin list. The same goes for default dynamics. You can pick whatever plugin that you use as your standard dynamics plugin, and it should be really easy to pull it up. And you can also have it be automatically inserted to any track that you want. Another really important setting is in the automation dialog, where you have the degree of thinning, which essentially will remove any points in your automation data that you don't need. I would recommend keeping this to more or most, because that way if you're dragging a fader while you're automating stuff, it will eliminate any points that you don't need, and that will save you a lot of processing power. Also make sure that delay compensation is set to samples and not milliseconds, because samples is a lot more accurate than milliseconds. So always keep this to samples. On the metering tab, you can pick what kind of metering you have. For the most part, you don't have to touch this unless you want any specific metering. You can go to track meters and just pick any of the available types. Depends on your preference and whatever you like. I will not go into detail of what this is. You can also change how it looks in the same dialog and just set whatever are your levels according to whatever preference that you have. Next, on the processing dialog, for the most part, you shouldn't change anything that's here. The one thing that is important is the TCE setting, which will select what algorithm you're using for time compression expansion, which is essentially how Pro Tools stretches out an audio clip. You can pick between Avid Time Shift, Avid Xform, or Avid TCE. I recommend trying each one out and seeing what you like best. The one thing to remember is that Avid Xform is a rendered only kind of stretch. So if you stretch a clip, it will have to render that clip. It's a really good algorithm, but it will have to be rendered down. Then on the MIDI settings, unless you're doing something really specific with MIDI, you shouldn't change any of these. Collaboration dialog is only relevant if you're working with other people on projects using Pro Tools Cloud. And finally, the synchronization dialog is only important if you're using some sort of machine control or syncing multiple systems. I'm not going to go into this because if you're working at home, you probably don't have to deal with this. Okay, so we've covered the basics of Pro Tools and how to set up Pro Tools according to whatever you need. And these are the basics. We've gone over the hardware dialog, the playback engine dialog, and the preferences dialog. All three of these dialogs will solve pretty much most of the problems that you might encounter in Pro Tools. So I'll see you guys in the next video.